Class. Welcome to the Lourie Lectures. You've arrived to Stories of Struggle with Claudia Smith Brinson, our guest instructor. She'll be presenting to us today. I'll go ahead and continue letting folks in. I'd like to introduce Jan Collins. She's one of our steering committee members, and she'll be introducing our guest instructor. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Good morning, everybody. Many of you may know Claudia Brinson from her byline because she wrote for many years at the state newspaper and at other newspapers as well in Greece and elsewhere. But for the last X number of years, she taught also at Columbia College and at USC teaching writing. And she has been researching this book, which was just published in the fall, for many, many years. I think basically more than 20 or more years. And so this book chronicles 20 years of racial struggle and progress in South Carolina. She has interviewed over the years more than 150 civil rights activists. And it's a fascinating story. I think we will all enjoy the class. So Claudia, over to you.
Well, I'm so grateful you're here. I describe writing this book sometimes as a spiritual quest. When I first came to South Carolina in the 80s to work as a reporter, I noticed very quickly that the elderly Black people that I talked to had a completely different story of South Carolina than the white official story that most people knew best. And it began to concern me, not just because what really happened was not what we knew, but also because many of these people were elderly. I was meeting people that were born in the 1890s, and I knew that their stories would be gone with them. And there are a variety of reasons that we don't know their stories. We don't know them because there was only a Black-owned newspaper in South Carolina from 41 to 54. So coverage after 54 depended on the Afro-American newspapers in places like Baltimore and Washington, or the Philadelphia paper. So these were papers that back then would come in the mail to you, but they had to have a reporter who knew in advance what was going to happen to have coverage. And then the white-owned newspapers that were in every small town, many of them were associated with the White Citizens Council or even the KKK, and were white supremacy newspapers. And so the stories were the stories of the white dominance. And so I think it's fair to call that censorship and propaganda. So the other reason that I wrote this book was because I was just overwhelmed by the wonder of the people that I talked to, how brave they were, how accomplished against incredible odds, and their perseverance, which is, I think, something if you read the book, you'll see is a dominant characteristic, that they go on no matter what, because they have a incredibly important goal, which is first what Reverend Hinton calls first-class citizenship. And what he means by that is that you were not a true citizen of the United States if you've been denied the vote. And South Carolina was very determined to deny the vote. So I began interviewing people for my newspaper career, but also to stay in touch with many of these people. And along the way, someone said, "Why isn't this a book? You know more about this than anybody else right now." And I said, I had two answers. Yeah, why isn't this a book? I need to write a book. And the other one was, I'm a single parent. I have a full-time job. I do some part-time work too. When am I going to do a book? And then I thought, well, you have to do a book because these stories will be gone if you don't. So what we're going to do in the first class is have pulled together some archival photographs. I'd like you to be able to see in your mind's eye the people that we're going to be talking about for the next 4 weeks. And so we're going to look at pictures pertaining to Reverend Hinton's time period. And then in the second class, we'll be looking at photographs related to the Briggs versus Elliott time period. And each time I'm going to try to be conscious of time so that we have at least 15 minutes to talk at the end. So I'm not just talk. And then the third, fourth classes, we will have even more. time for conversation. So I'm going to go to share screen and to the PowerPoint. And I'm starting here with Levi Bird. So Levi Bird was born in North Carolina in the 1890s. And he was had a good job with a freight company where he would load freight into trains. And he was, the phrase is unschooled, meaning that because of the deprivation of education to Black citizens, he had only a year or two of school. In an evening when he was loading freight, he noticed that in a car, you know, and this is a time when deeply poor people, you're thinking Depression, are traveling as what were called hobos on trains. He noticed an inscription in the train, and on the one side it said, "What will your life be?" And on the other side it said in chalk, "Your life will be whatever you make it." And he took that to heart, and he moved to be with his sister in Cheraw, South Carolina in the 1930s. And in 1933, Dizzy Gillespie's band was based in South Carolina, in that town, but all traveling all over the place. And of course, these were musicians that were experiencing different life from basic South Carolinians, who were mostly sharecroppers at this point in time, or service people, housekeepers, janitors, and those kind of jobs. So one of the band people was considered not respectful enough to the white citizens and was murdered. And the story was that he was put on a train track, and then what was remaining of his body was hidden. And Levi Bird was outraged by this and went through the town trying to find out what was going on, and was beaten to an inch of his life. And that was when he became very invested in the NAACP. And by 1937, he was in full contact with the national NAACP, and he was working hard to create a state conference in the NAACP. At this point, there had been strong NAACP branches in Columbia and in Charleston, but they would come and go because of the incredible pressure of the work life that Black people had, and also of white people being very anti any sort of organization that would protect Black people. So he had his eye out, and he was corresponding regularly with the national NAACP, and he came upon Reverend Hinton. So look at these fierce eyes. I love this portrait of Reverend Hinton. You can see in that gaze that this is a man who's not going to budge. And he was an exceptional person, just like Levi Bird was. But what I'm going to say here is I want to say that one of the things that fascinates me so much about the people I interviewed is, and I can't find the right language here, if you can help me with it, I'd be grateful, is people you would think of as ordinary people are doing extraordinary things every day. So the people that we might say, oh, just an ordinary person, is getting up in the morning and deciding, I might die today, but I'm working for my rights, and I'm working for the rights of others. Reverend Hinton was orphaned at 4 and sent to New York and brought up by an aunt. In World War I, he was one of a few hundred Black men who went into the military. The white powers that be didn't want armed Black men. And so very few Black people served in World War I. I think it's about 600. Who were officers, and he was one of the officers. He was an infantry lieutenant. He mustered out in Augusta, Georgia, and Augusta, Georgia had an all Black owned insurance company called Pilgrim Life. And he was hired by that. He traveled around a bit and ended up in 1938, Augusta was the headquartering himself in Columbia. And he and Levi Bird became friends, but sort of competitive friends in a way. And Hinton was not in favor of a state conference because he felt like the Columbia branch was very strong. And he was involved with not only the Columbia branch and the NAACP, but what were called citizens councils. And there were a variety of citizen councils in each county that were working on the vote or on education. And they were affiliated secretly with the NAACP, but they called themselves Citizens Council because that was a way to dodge the NAACP label. And so he is running several of these councils. He's getting things done, including getting all the way to the federal government to get them to stop the use in Colombia of military police officers harassing Black people in the entertainment district. And the military police officers were not supposed to have anything to do with the arresting or harassment of white people, but or Black people. They were supposed to be just paying attention to the military. But what was happening in Colombia was the white police were encouraging the Black military, the white military, to clear out Black areas of town. And he went to the federal government and got an investigation accomplished. And so this showed how well he could accomplish things in a very difficult time. And he was encouraged to accept the state conference post. And he said if he would, he was going to tear it up and build it back again. And Levi Baird said, okay, do it. So with Hinton, someone who's accomplished, he knows from his business experience and from traveling as a businessman, and also from, I think, just a superior intellect and a real work ethic. He barely slept. He's commuting to Augusta all the time and doing all this work in Colombia on civil rights. And he has 4 children, and his wife has died, and he has a housekeeper. He's just a man who doesn't sleep and works all the time for his goals. And his goal is his first-class citizenship. So he gets right to work. He makes very strong relationships with Thurgood Marshall and Walter White. Thurgood Marshall is the special counsel. Walter White is executive secretary of the NAACP. And he starts lawsuits. So what the NAACP is doing in this period of time is they are going state by state, right by right, lawsuit by lawsuit, petitioner by petitioner, which is a very time-consuming way to get things done. But they believe that the Constitution has promised them their rights, and that they can't, while they will be defeated in state court, that they will win in the Supreme Court. And most often they do through the 14th Amendment, which promises that the rights given to the citizens of the United States cannot be taken away by individual states. And so what happens is under Hinton in 43, he finds petitioners each time. He encourages a lawsuit for equal pay for teachers. And we'll talk about this more with Briggs versus Elliott, but essentially taxes were local for schools as well as parental funding. And there was some state funding. And what you had was white brick, heated playground, library, water fountains, indoor toilet schools for whites only. And then Black schools, their children were going to Masonic. The Masons had hunting lodges. They had meeting places, abandoned houses, an extra building behind a church that the parents kept going. They had privies, they brought in their water, they brought in coal for oil drums. Their books were the discards from the white schools. They walked to school where the white children rode buses, and their teachers were teaching 60, 70 students in ungraded classes. While in the white schools at this point in time, you had classes of 30 students for each grade. And so this horrific situation is exacerbated by the fact that teachers are paid about a quarter, Black teachers, of what white teachers are. So one of the first things they do is go after equal teacher pay. And they've got a great case here. If people are teaching 3 times as many students for 1/10 as much money, something's wrong here. And so they get a judge that we're going to be talking about, some J. Wades Warings, who looks at the inequities and says, yes, this is wrong. And I want to point out here that there were 2 petitioners, Melissa Smith and then Viola Duvall. Melissa Smith was harassed so much, she left the state, and they went to look for another petitioner and came up with Viola Duvall, who stayed through the lawsuit, but then married and left the state too. What would happen was you would get constant death threats, for example. And sometimes the NAACP approach was fraught because petitioners would just disappear, meaning they had either left under death threat or they had been murdered. So that's 1943 to 1946. That's how long that takes. In 1946, Hinton is going to go on to another lawsuit, but I wanted to introduce you to a few other people. This is Majeska Simpkins. You can go visit her house in Columbia. While Hinton was the president of the NAACP State Conference, she was the corresponding secretary. She was also a woman of income. She owned not only this house here in Columbia, but a variety of other properties that she got rent from. She was affiliated with Victory Savings Bank, and you can see the building from that right across from Ellen and Benedict. She helped fund the Black-owned newspaper that existed from 41 to 54, the Lighthouse and Informer. And she was close to Thurgood Marshall. Sometimes when he was coming into South Carolina for these lawsuits, he would stay at her house because Columbia was, a central point for people for lawsuits, but also because she was a strategizer. She was one of those people that's not afraid of anybody, would say anything. And in that way, she and Hinton were like, they were fierce. They were actually kind of ferocious. And they actually often, I'm not sure how they survived. They astonished the white supremacists in the things that they would say. And I'm going to give you some examples of that later. And this is John McCrae, who ran the Lighthouse and Informer, the newspaper from 41 to 54. It was funded mostly by Majeska Simpkins and a few other donors. And they had a falling out, which is one of the reasons that the newspaper ended. He was a hot-tempered man, but he was a great investigative reporter. And often when there were reports of lynchings, Hinton would send him to the town to question people. He would find out what was going on. Most often they would appeal to the federal government because they weren't going to get any support from white law enforcement in these little towns. And most often the federal government would say it's a state matter, but they would publicize what had happened. So he was risking his life regularly going into little towns, and I'll tell you a story later about a specific one, to document the violence of white supremacy. He also was writing political pieces and was a very important voice for the Black community. And this is one of the letters. I wanted to read you an excerpt from that. I don't know how well you can see the print here, but South Caroliniana Library, where I got many of these pictures, also has Reverend Hinton's papers and also McCrae's papers and Simpkins' papers. And one of the things, when I saw this letter, I thought, wow, because this is 1940s. He's upset about a resolution that he finds astonishing, and he writes, and he's upset about the debate where they use words like miscegenation, mongrelization, and amalgamation, which all are located with this myth that Black men want white women. And this truly is a myth. There's been a lot of research. Almost all of the lynchings are claimed to be rape, and almost all of them are not. And the Equal Justice Institute has been tracking this down. The NAACP was following it. So that's why I call it a myth. He writes, Negroes throughout South Carolina disclaim any idea of amalgamation of white and Negroes, even though during days not far removed from 1944, white men took advantage of Negro women for immoral purposes. Hence the lighter skinned Negro living in South Carolina for most of our Negro women had been left alone, all Negroes, for the most part, would have been Black. Okay, think about that. I talked to many, many people who did not allow their daughters to babysit in white houses, to work in any sort of cleaning capacity in white houses because of the high risk of sexual assault. And he's naming it here. And I think given the violence and the intent on suppressing Black voices, it's an interesting example of how he spoke truth to power every day. He was often writing to the newspapers, and they did, interestingly enough, the State and the Record, publish his letters to the editor while they weren't covering many Black events. And he made speeches, and he would let people know where he was making speeches. And this carries over into the sit-in movement, where there was a point of pride in saying, this is what we're going to do. This is the day we're going to do it. Come on. I should have mentioned at the beginning, I have two upsetting pictures, and this is one of them. And I have them here because I don't think it's enough to just talk about the violence. You need to have in your head how often this violence happened and how extreme it was. So this is Isaac Woodard. And Isaac Woodard was on a bus going toward Batesburg, Leesville. He was with many other soldiers in World War II, had been mustered out. Intention was to go home. And as you probably know, Black people were forced to the back of the buses. There were no bathrooms in the buses at that time. He asked the bus driver to stop so he could go to the bathroom. The bus driver told him to sit back down and shut up. And he said something along the lines of, "I am a man, treat me as a man." And I want you to know that there was an enormous swath of murders of Black veterans. So Black veterans came back from being the rescuers of democracy. They're over in Europe and Asia, and they're fighting and risking their lives for this idea of democracy. And they come home, they can't walk into the front door of a white person's house. They can't walk into the front door of a store. They can't try on shoes or clothes in a store. They have to go to the back window of a restaurant that's owned by a white person. They have risked their lives, and this is what they come back to. And so Isaac Woodard, the bus drivers had police powers. They could do anything they wanted to white riders. And what this bus driver does is he stops, he gets off in Batesburg, Leesville. He gets the police chief. He gets Woodard to walk out. Woodard says, "I just want to go to the bathroom." The police chief starts pushing him around. He has a weight-loaded baton in his hand. He whacks Woodard with it. Woodard grabs it to stop being beaten. The assistant to the police chief pulls his gun. They take him around the corner and they use the baton to gouge out his eyes. He wakes up in a cell the next day blind. They take money from his pocket to pay the fine and then drive him to the Veterans Hospital. People get in touch with Reverend Hinton. They have a hard time finding Woodard initially. Because Woodard is moved from the hospital when they say we can't do anything for you to New York, which was where he had some relatives. And during the hunt for him, McCrae has gone to Batesburg, Leesville. He's tracked down the right town. At first they thought it was still Augusta. And he's interviewed people and he provides information to the movie star and director Orson Welles, who has a radio show. And Orson Welles, you can find these at archive.org. They're fascinating to listen to. He says, "We're coming to find you, Mr. Policeman." And he talks about the rights of Black citizens and Black veterans. And he's very ferocious about it. And when he gets the name, he publicizes the name. He does 3 of these. And then Woodard has the attention of the nation, who are horrified at what has happened to him. There is a fundraiser. This is the prize fighter Joe Louis, who was world champion, so to speak, for several years. At the fundraiser in New York, Billie Holiday sang, Woody Guthrie sang. It was an all-star cast. They raised about $10,000 for Mr. Woodard. And at this point in time, Harry Truman finds out about what is happening through Walter White, because there's been another horrific attack on 2 veterans in Georgia and their wives. They have been pulled out of a car, the 4 of them, and murdered. 60 shots were fired into their bodies. And this was in Morris Ford, Georgia. And Walter White brings up these 2 instances. And Harry Truman, who uses racial slurs in his speech and has been brought up by a daughter of the Confederacy, still has the sense to say, this is wrong. These people were fighting for our democracy and they shouldn't be treated this way. And he's so upset, he gets in touch with his attorney general, and they decide that what they can do is they can bring a lawsuit because Woodard's federal rights not to be tortured under arrest have been violated. It goes to trial, and as is the law in South Carolina, the police chief, whose name is Shull, is acquitted. The judge is so upset at knowing, and this is weight he's wearing again from the teacher lawsuit and from another lawsuit we're going to talk about, that he takes a walk around the block so he won't get a 5-minute verdict. The nation is horrified, and Woodard actually does well with the rest of his life. There is a film on PBS now about his maiming and how he conducted the rest of his life. He was not bitter, he said. He invested his money in rental property. He had nephews that would collect the rent, and his wife abandoned him, but he stayed close to other relatives and conducted himself in an honorable and good life afterward. This is Harry Truman, and to his left as you're facing the screen is Walter White. Walter White was really interesting, another brave character. As you can see, he looks white. He was blonde and then gray with blue eyes, and he would go where they were lynching and pose as a white person, or and get the information and take it back to the NAACP. And his biography is really interesting because of this bravery. And this is the actual meeting of what was called the National Emergency Committee Against Mob Violence that energized Truman to act. This is George Elmore, and this is the next lawsuit where Hinton is busy changing South Carolina. So George Elmore was an entrepreneur. He owned a store that's right next to the big church on Gervais Street. It was knocked down. There's a plaque there to him now. He ran a taxi company. He was a photographer. He just had all sorts of businesses. He also looked white. And so from 44 on, Hinton had been trying to get Black people registered to vote. And this took trickery. What they would do was they would wait, registration books would be in stores, and they would wait outside a store. And when a clerk pulled out a registration book for a white person, they would rush over to try and register. Sometimes the clerk would just slam the book shut, most often, and they would fail. So they were in 1946, I think, outside a store on Hardin Street. And George Elmore walked up. There were 5 of them, McCrae and Hinton were among them. And they were waiting for just what I explained. And Elmore said, well, let me walk over there. He's a very gregarious kind of guy. And he walked over, he chats up the clerk. He buys a Coca-Cola. She assumes he's white, and she starts complaining, and she uses a profanity about the Black men across the street. And she says, it's very important for white people to vote, to keep them under our thumb. And she pulls out the book, and she instructs George Elmore in signing his name. He signs his name, and then they go to the address page, and he puts an address for that neighborhood, which is a Black neighborhood. And she says, well, you're, insert word, 1, 2. And then she says, just go get your friends, go get your friends. And so he gets the 5 men over there, and they all register to vote. Then when he goes to vote, he's denied the vote, and he sues on his behalf and those of 60 others. Marshall argues the lawsuit. It goes before J. Waties Waring, who says it is time for South Carolina to join the Union, that a vote is an obvious part of citizenship. South Carolina appeals it to the federal court. Federal court says, yes, part of citizenship is voting. You cannot prevent people from voting. And so then what does South Carolina do? It creates a segregation oath. And so, and this was called the all-white primary. And I'll give you a little bit more before I go to the second lawsuit. Many Southern states had what was called the all-white primary. South Carolina's electorate was 43% Black and had between 5,000 and 10,000 Black people registered to vote over the 30s to the 40s. Now think about that. Why? Because they had grandfather clauses. Your grandfather had to have been in the Confederacy. They had land ownership. They had requirements. They had poll taxes, and they had a white-only primary. Only white people can vote in the primary. So in Smith versus Allwright, the Supreme Court ruled that this is a citizenship right. And so other states are dropping this requirement. South Carolina is holding on to it. And so when this happens, when Elmore wins, they create a segregation oath. And so, yeah, you can register to vote, but if you don't sign the segregation oath, we're not taking your ballot. And so a man named David Brown in Beaufort sues for that. Waring is a little upset about getting this lawsuit back in court. And he tells the board of electors, I'll put you in jail. And this unnerves them. And so 35,000 people vote before the next primary. And this is another letter from Hinton. in which he said, this state gave birth to the most diabolic scheme of the 21st century to nullify democracy as it is defined. And what he's referring to here is when Smith versus Allwright was decided by the Supreme Court, the South Carolina legislature met under the behest of Governor Olin D. Johnston and repealed every single voting law, 150 laws trying to keep the whites only primary. And Hinton said, it is high time to redeem itself by producing some statesmen, and then Waring follows through with rejoin the Union. We have people registering to vote now. I wanted you to see, this is Majestica Simpkins' handwriting, signing for both, for the two of them. You see how he has all caps? This was a habit then. You would see this in a lot of the letters, all caps as emphasis. High time that the white supremacy government of South Carolina should redeem its 87-year-old history by producing some statesmen. It's referring there to, post-Reconstruction. This is the other upsetting picture I'm going to show you. This happens in 47. This is Willie Earl. Willie Earl was a Black man who lived near Greenville. He had epilepsy. He had been a truck driver. Because of epileptic attacks, he had lost his job. On a certain night, a taxi driver named Brown was assaulted by a Black rider. And the taxi drivers started talking about this. Somehow, Willie Earl's name came up, and he was arrested by the chief of police and put in the jail. He was not charged. Mr. Brown had not identified Willie Earl. We just had said a Black man. He was in the hospital. He didn't have a name. He didn't have a description. He dies. 35 of these taxi drivers get together. They go to the jail. The jailer lets them in, and they take Willie Earl toward Greenville and near a slaughterhouse, and they murder him first with knives, and after he's dead, they shoot up his body, which was a habit of lynchers. Then they call at dawn to a coroner's office, a funeral home, and the funeral home director calls Hinton. Reverend Hinton and George Elmore come, and they take pictures of the body. This is one of the least upsetting ones that they have because his face has been reconstructed. This picture goes all over the United States. The FBI is called in. Thurman is the governor. He's not happy with this, but he's not happy with what he calls mob rule. Within days, the FBI, because people would brag about this, the FBI has arrested 31 people. 26 of them confess, and they're put out on bond, even though they've confessed to a murder. The trial, which is called by Dame Rebecca West, a journalist who had just covered the Nuremberg trials about Nazis, has come down thinking it's a parallel kind of event. She calls it the opera at Greenville because it's so overly dramatic in terms of the white lawyers on both sides defending white supremacy. They stand on the tables and declaim. One of them says, if it was a mad dog, I would have shot. One of the prosecuting attorneys, says, if it was a mad dog, I would have shot it. And so Willie Earl needs to be dead. They just declaim horrifying things like this. And Dame Rebecca West documents it in the New Yorker. They are acquitted. They're acquitted because the judge rules that the confessions can only implicate themselves. They can't implicate others. And almost all the confessions identify the person with the knife and the person with the gun. But because their confessions are only to implicate themselves, and these two men do not confess, they get off. They all get off. And the prosecutors who did just a typical white supremacy, barely going to do the case whatsoever, had actually thought that there might be some minor charges that had been laid against them that they might be found guilty of, but they're not. And so all across the United States, there are headlines about mob rule, about the support of lynching by whites in their communities, and by lynching being used exactly as it is, as a means of not only human, but political suppression. And South Carolina is regularly in the news for this. It is the head of the southern states. It was the 12th most likely to have lynchings in the terms of the count that Equal Justice Institute has done so far. This is a happier note here. This is Reverend Hinton. If you go in man in hat, woman, man in hat with tie, man without tie and without hat, that's Reverend Hinton voting in 1948 in Columbia. The archivist loves this picture because of the way that you can geographically locate yourself to with the Indian Motorcycle Building. If you can see this a little closer, you can see these are some very happy people. And I think Hinton said something along the lines of he was happy as a lark on the day that he voted. So this is the other upsetting picture, and the last of the upsetting pictures I'm going to show you. This is Reverend Archie Ware. He had a very different experience voting. He voted in Calhoun Falls. He's a minister. When he comes out of the polling booth, he is attacked by men with hawkbill knives. These are slaughter knives, and this is what was used on Willie Earl. There are pictures that Mr. McRae took of him where you can see slices that are from knee to up to hip. And he was also beaten with objects. Police were watching outside the polling place. He was left for dead. His compatriots got him to a doctor where he was stitched up, and that's when McRae took the pictures. He left the state, but before he left, he identified the assailants. When the police chief of Calhoun Falls was interviewed about why aren't there any arrests, he said, oh, it could take 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, 30 years. In other words, he wasn't going to do a thing. And this is the last picture I'm going to show you in this compendium of what it was like then. This is also 1948, and this is the 4th Ward, the Waverly neighborhood or Allen Benedict neighborhood. And this line is right before 6 o'clock. And this should give you resonance right now in terms of what Georgia is doing. These are people who won't get to vote because this is their only polling place. They've all turned out. They're registered voters, but the polling place is going to close deliberately, and they're not going to get to vote. You may remember that I mentioned that 35,000 people registered after Waring's decision. So I want to tell you a little more about Reverend Hinton. I'm going to go back to that strong face, and then we're going to talk about this. So Hinton was a man who could make things happen because he was dedicating his life to it. However, I really object, and I've got some links to this, to the idea of the great man in history, that there's no such thing as one person alone making things happen. So I wanted you to see the pictures of some of his group, Mr. McRae, Ms. Simpkins, Mr. Byrd. There were, of course, hundreds others. George Elmore is the one who sues, Viola Duvall, Melissa Smith. They take on the task of being a petitioner. When you took on the task of being a petitioner, your name was public. And so your life was at risk in these times. And so it's not only that Reverend Hinton is determined to create first-class citizenship, it's that there are people who are belonging to the NAACP or belonging to the citizens councils or teaching in the schools, and they know that they're seeing injustice and that it is not only dooming their success and their safety and their peace of mind, but that of their children and their grandchildren. And so they're willing to step forward and do whatever it takes to make the world a better place. And he is very important, of course. So is Thurgood Marshall. But this doesn't happen without all the other people that are involved. And so in the book, I have a chapter that's dedicated to Reverend Hinton, and I have a chapter that's dedicated to Reverend Ivory, not because I think they are the great man proof, but because they are men who can gather around them at the right time, probably in the wrong place, given how violent South Carolina was, but the right place in terms of how much it needed them, and encourage others who are ready to join them And so if those others weren't ready, if they hadn't stepped forward, we wouldn't know about Reverend Hinton. I think it's one of the reasons that I wanted you to see some of the faces in terms of the upsetting pictures or just those great lines of people voting. Let's go back to George Elmore, all these people who are going to wait. This is, I think, in May, and we know that May is already going to be 80 degrees. It's hot. See the umbrellas that some people are holding. Wait all day. They're being paid a wage that does not allow for this. They're probably giving up a meal or two or three to do this, but they're there to vote because they feel that this is their nation too. So I'm going to see if I can figure out how to stop share screen. And I'm hoping that you have some things to say about this. And so I want to hear from you very much. And I'm hoping that you're going to now talk. I think, Stephanie, can you unmute everybody if you're there?
Everybody needs to unmute themselves.
Okay.
That's how it works on Zoom.
I think I saw a hand. And I'm going to put myself on gallery view so I can see you. And if you have your name, then I can call on you, so that we're not stepping on each other's words, maybe.
If you don't have audio, you can type something in the chat box. I'll relay it out to Claudia.
So Joan, was it your hand I saw?
No, it was not my hand. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, it's gonna be dangerous if you scratch your nose. I might call on you.
No, but I do have a comment. The gentleman you were talking about was Levi Bird when he went to Cheraw, and out of interest to whatever the situation was, I had an uncle who lived in Cheraw during that time.
Uh-huh.
He was active, but he was probably not classified like you said. The musicians were classified. He happened to be a dentist, very prominent dentist in Cheraw, and I know that he was active during that time. With the, excuse me, I have pollen in my throat, but very active, with the civil rights and the NAACP. And when you said that, I perked up, and I'm just wondering, and in all probability, he probably knew Levi Bird,
Yeah, Levi Bird came as a plumber's helper, but then the man he was assisting died, and he became the only plumber. So I think everybody knew Levi Bird.
Yeah, and
plus he sold newspapers from a red wagon in the middle of town to supplement his income, white-owned and black-owned newspapers. Mm-hmm. So he was a public person.
Yeah, and Cheraw is a very small town, so everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew my uncle. So I'm pretty sure their paths crossed at some particular time.
Yeah, the NAACP often was being led by people of prominence in the Black community. So think about dentists, doctors, principals, and ministers. One of the things I often talk about when I'm talking about Briggs and all the ministers involved is that there are reasons that almost all the NAACP branches presidents were ministers. Think about it. Their Black congregation's not going to fire them. They're working for their rights. Yeah. They are protected somewhat as men of the cloth. There are murders of Black ministers, but they are fewer. And the reason for that is they are understood to be men of God, and in the Christian community, this would be frowned upon, even if you were a white supremacist. A horrible way to say it, but that's how it was. Mm-hmm. And they're also very likely to have education that has not been accessible to others. So Reverend Hinton's education, he was a Baptist preacher, was through a Bible school before he went into World War I. I mentioned that Levi Bird had not had education. McRae had a lot of people had a high school, and at that time, getting a high school education was very difficult. There were only 36 Black high schools in all of South Carolina. And this was because of funding again. So even getting a high school education was a very difficult task to accomplish. But part of the thought here was that with your education and your prestige, it was be somewhat easier for you to deal with the white power structure. And this holds over into the sit-in movement too. One of the leaders in Orangeburg had grown up in the North, and he was planning on leaving South Carolina State because he was so appalled by he got into a lot of trouble. He was beaten up several times by police, and he thought, I won't be alive if I stay here. But the students came to him and said, you know how to talk to white people. And they persuaded him to stay and be their spokesman. So one of the parts of life here was that there were sundown towns. At sundown, there was a whistle and you had to leave the center of town. If you looked into a white person's eyes, that was considered a challenge. One of the sit-in participants told me that when she was arrested, the person booking her said, what color are your eyes? And she said, I looked up so he could see my eyes. And it was the first time I'd ever looked into the eyes of a white man because it was dangerous. Mm-hmm. If you're on the sidewalk, you had to step off. It was an extremely dangerous time for Black people. And so the people who did step forward sometimes had some protection. There were also people that were very important to the movement at this time, who were, how I think of them, as the money men. So oftentimes they were the funeral home directors, for example. They had money and prestige, but they didn't publicly join the NAACP, but they were the ones collecting the money that would fund a lot of these lawsuits. And Reverend Hinton was very proud of the fact that he, when we get to Briggs versus Elliott, he was handing thousands of dollars in periodic checks to Thurgood Marshall to fund the lawsuits. He raised $6,000 for the voting lawsuit, for example. And people are donating to NAACP branches with nickels and quarters because that's all they have. So it's a complicated structure to make what happens happen. And I left a lawsuit out here, which is that John Wrighton, who grew up in the Charleston area and went to Avery, which at that time was a private high school, and then went into the World War II, came back and wanted to go to law school. College of Charleston turned him down because he was Black. He wanted to sue. At this point in time, there was public conversation about this, although Thurgood Marshall didn't want to back the lawsuit, and Hinton was wavering, and the city, what did they do? I think they bought the College of Charleston or something for a while. It was a city private school to keep it from being desegregated. But anyway, Hinton was kidnapped by the KKK from his Augusta boarding house because of conversation about Wrighton getting into the College of Charleston. They dragged him out into the woods. How it happened was he came out of his boarding house because there'd been a knock on the door. They said, someone was saying, oh, someone hit your car. As soon as he stepped in his pajamas and bathrobe, onto the doorstep, several white men grabbed him, threw him into a car, held him down with their feet, drove him out into the woods, tied him to a tree and began beating him with chains. Now the KKK would sometimes do this to kill you, sometimes do this to frighten you enough to make you leave. And in the midst of this, his landlady had called Columbia and had called his family, and a white man, it was a mixed neighborhood, and had called the police. And then the landlady called the police. And then there were ministers out looking, trying to find him. The police were out looking. It was on the radio. The men had their cars on with their headlights on and their radio. And when they heard that they were being looked for, they left him. They unchained him and said, don't follow us. He immediately followed them. He got some license plate numbers. There was a gun left that had been dropped in the gutter at the boarding house. He trudged. He was more than 30 or 40 minutes outside of Augusta. It's a long walk. Along the way, a bus picks him up. He made a joke about it later. I talked to people who had seen him and seen how badly injured he was. He went to work the next day. A couple of days later, there was an event, and he said it was good for the immortal souls of his friends, the preachers who were out looking for him, that they didn't find these white men. So that was one of the ways that a lot of these people maneuvered through this, is they had this wry, not bitter sense of humor about what was going on. He said, "I would rather die than live on my knees." And he meant it. He was living his life that way. So I'm still longing for questions.
Claudia, this is
Comments?
Sandra Berger.
Sandra.
I have a question. What did the League of Women Voters do during the mid-40s to the mid-50s during much of this period? Did they take any position one way or the other?
They were late to come to it. And actually, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were coming through, the League of Women Voters was very angry about the possibility that Black men were going to get the vote instead of white women. And there was a split among the women who were campaigning for voting rights, because the white women were arguing, some of these white women, that white women were educated and Black people were not. Well, why weren't Black people educated? They had been enslaved, and then there were no schools provided while they were for white people. And so there was a big split. Same thing happened with the churches. You know, that's why you had United Methodist and United Presbyterian. There were splits between the North and South, where very important groups that one would hope would focus on rights were splitting over race. And I can't tell you, Sandra, it's a really good question. When the League of Women Voters started promoting voting rights for all, as they do very well now.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. One of the things that happens when I talk about this sometimes is that the white people listening who are of a certain age say, why didn't I know about this? I had this happen with someone who lived in Sumter. Sumter was a brutal place. And my response is kind of layered. Part of it is I've already addressed with you, you know, that white newspapers deliberately were not writing about much of this. And so if your reliance was on newspapers or white-owned radio, TV was brand new and not in hardly anybody's home. In fact, when we get to Somerton and Clarendon County, most people there still didn't have electricity and telephones. So there was a limited access to information for Black people, but white people had access. And so, for example, in Sumter and in Orangeburg in the 50s, there were petitions for desegregating schools after Brown versus Board of Education. And people were fired, people were harassed. The Ku Klux Klan quintupled or more its membership, started burning crosses. There was one weekend where there were 100 crosses burned in one county. It's hard to say, why don't you know something? I think this is when we would have to talk about white privilege. Your life was privileged, you had a school. You maybe only encountered, if you were a white privileged person in a small South Carolina town, a Black person through the services they provided you on a farm or in your house. And they weren't going to put their lives at risk telling you about their lives, honestly. And so this idea that slaves loved their masters is really kind of, it's perverse. There's a really powerful book called Out of the House of Bondage by Thalia Glimpf. And she was a USC professor that's now at UNC. And there had been a very celebrated book where I think it was Jacqueline Dowd Hall had collected the diaries of white women on plantations during the Civil War. And it was all about, a lot of it was about this noble woman, surviving and feeding her people. And what Claudia Smith did was she went back into the diaries and looked at how the white women wrote about the enslaved people on the plantation. And what she uncovered was horrific violence by white women against the women and men in their houses and the house servants. There were instruments of tortures in rooms that were used. If you tried to escape, you were often not just branded, but certain teeth in your mouth would be pulled out to both punish you permanently in terms of eating and also to make you recognizable. There were instruments that would be locked around your face and your neck to make it hard for you to move or to talk if you were sassy. And so it's a very hard book to read. It was very hard for her to write, but it gives you a different view of things that many of us may have chosen not to know. And so one of the difficulties in writing this book was featuring the heroism of the Black people while noting the incredible constant violence and obstruction by white people. And so I think of the book as both very dark and very bright. It's bright in terms of the heroism and the courage, and it's dark in terms of the incredible consistency. Every lawsuit is lost in South Carolina and then appealed and then has to make its way all the way to Supreme Court over years. Briggs versus Elliott starts in 46. That teacher lawsuits, 43 to 46. The voting lawsuit is from 44 when Hinton is determined to get people registered to 48. People's lives are going by all this time while they're trying to get these rights. And that was one problem with these lawsuits in that they take so long. They take a terrific toll on the petitioners. And also there have to be one state by state. Smith versus Allwright, it's a Supreme Court decision, and some states obey the Supreme Court and some, like South Carolina, do not. They didn't. It had to go through court all over again in South Carolina. So there's obstacle after obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. The governor after Johnston, Governor Burns, who was a Supreme Court justice for a year, worked with FDR on the Depression. It was truly a man of the world, comes down to South Carolina and supposedly runs for governor because he wants to maintain white supremacy and says publicly things like, it's always been a white man's country and it will always be a white man's country. So in a weird way, this book has always been relevant because we should know what was going on, but it's especially relevant right now in terms of the way people are emboldened to talk about white supremacy and the way that we're seeing things like voting rights impeded again. It's something that every one of us needs to be thinking about, I think. So here I went and preached because you guys weren't asking questions. Myra.
I just wanted to say that reading your book, I was struck all the way through the courage of the people who stood up, knew what they had to lose, their jobs, their lives, and so on. And it just floored me. It really did. I was heartbroken in a way and impressed.
Well, it's a question I hope sort of two here. I want you to think about who is the person that stays with you over our time together, but also what are things that you would risk yourselves for? And I think most people would say the people they're closest to, but how do you broaden that out? Because as Myra's pointing out, these people are going to pay personal prices, right, Myra? Like losing their job or losing their lives. They're going to pay personal prices, not an abstract price. And who or what, do you pay a price for? And it's never too late to stand up.
We've been sheltered, really.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Going back to, you said some people asked, why didn't I know about this? But I grew up in the North. I grew up in Philadelphia, New York, area, and that's where I was raised. But you're saying the privileged in the South say they had no idea, but we were living in the North. We basically knew this was going on, and basically it was because of word of mouth, because of the great migration my parents had, and then we all had relatives here in the South. We always got word of lynchings and all of the other destructive things that were going on with the African American race. So we always knew these things were going on, the lynchings and the beatings and whatever else. And it wasn't pretty because we had people, relatives that would have to sneak off in the middle of the night, get on a freight train, come north, and live with other relatives because their lives were threatened. So we always knew, even though we weren't living here, we always knew what was going on down here. So that kind of gives you an idea of the polarization and the separation of the races. And you have the white privilege living right there where it was happening. And they didn't know, or said they didn't know this was going on, and they were right here in the same town,
Well, I sort of get on, I hope this doesn't sound like attack mode, but people were choosing not to know, right? Everybody knew who was, right? Everybody knew who was in the KKK. They knew their mayor and their police chief.
100%.
They knew when there was a lynching.
Didn't care.
Yeah. So the white people, it was a no, not no.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for the Great Migration was because of the extreme numbers of lynchings at the end of during Reconstruction, and then during the wars. Millions of Black people went up north and don't want to come back, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
You have some to today will not step foot south of the Mason-Dixon line because of that. Very bitter, very bitter. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. That was very, very interesting.
We're out of time. Thank you. Thank you, Joan and Myra and Sandra and anybody else who was brave enough to speak up. I really want you to talk. I don't want to just be myself. So I will show you some more pictures next time when we start talking about Briggs and Hinton. Hinton is there. He's still fully there. I'm very grateful that you're here, and I hope you'll be back next week.
Thanks, Claudia.
Yes, thank
Really,
you.
So much.
really interesting.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia, for the great class and for students for the commentary. Hope to see you back here next week. I'll share the link for the recording, and I hope you have a great day.
Stephanie.
Yes.
Thank you.
Could you just keep me on here for a moment? I have a question for you.
I sure will.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.
Around, but y'all are
Bye, everyone.
free to go.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Sandra.
Listen, I guess you heard that I'm not going to come in. I'm sorry with that time we spent, but I have not been feeling too well. So I thought it might be better just to stay here until I hear from what the doctor says.
Absolutely.
Anyway, one question. Do you want me there 5 minutes only, or just how do you want me there? When do you want me there early, or how do you want me to do it?
I open the class 15 minutes prior. So I'll be jumping on at 12:15. And if you want to do any test runs with your share screen or anything at all, you're welcome to come in and we can do any practice, but it's optional. I recommend you come no later than, 5 minutes prior. Give yourself at least 5 minutes to settle in, but you're pretty much a veteran at Zoom at this point, so I don't have any concerns with your technical knowledge.
I'm more concerned with the share screen just to make sure it doesn't, I don't lose it here because we got it there working fine. So I just wanted to check that and be sure that's okay. And I do have a question. If I share the screen and just keep it that way, is that a problem? And then just have my little face showing up when I'm talking, because I don't know that it's going to be necessary for them to see a whole screen of me. That's pretty boring. That's like putting them to sleep from the get-go.
Well, yeah, everybody once you share screen, we'll see the screen, and how we view the screen versus your face or the gallery, that's up to the individual.
Okay.
So I recommend that you have the share screen up while you've got your presentation. If you want to open it for questions, it's always nice to stop the share so that folks can have the gallery view as the screen, but it's optional. You know, what's not ideal is if you're done with the presentation, the last slide is sitting there and we're trying to have a conversation around it. So that's the only reason I ask. If you're done with the presentation and you're inviting conversation or questions, stop the share screen, because that encourages people to see the other faces and see you, and it's more of like a conversational view. Does that make sense?
That sounds good. Yeah. What I'd like to do is, because now I didn't do this when I was teaching to the university, but I thought since I don't have to worry about trying to find the file. If I just get in there a few minutes early, put the screen on, slideshow on, and then just talk to them with the slideshow in the background. I think that'll work, don't you?
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Perfect. That's what we'll do.
That's what I usually do. Is
hide you
with the when you share the screen, or like when Claudia shared the screen, I have the speaker view on the as a thumbnail, so I can choose to see your face as a thumbnail, or I can just I can just hide your face and just see the screen. That's my decision. Everybody who's zooming in will have that decision to make for themselves, unless you stop your video.
No, my question is if I basically, before everybody gets in, I've got my screen up already.
Yeah, we can do that.
They're gonna be able to see you?
Yeah, they can see me because there's like a gallery view on the side.
Okay, so but you wouldn't be full screen. You'd be, or would you?
It's like, well, everybody's got their choice. Right now I've got speaker view. I can do gallery view. So if you share the screen, the faces will be on the side.
Okay, because you're full screen right now. And see, what I was afraid of, well, all right, when you let us in, you'll be in a little box.
Well, let me show you something.
Okay.
Can you see? I'm sharing the screen. You probably see my desktop. So
Right.
you can see a little face plus most of my screen. And you can change it around depending on what you want. But,
Yes.
you know,
we're in the corner.
Yeah.
You're no longer the whole screen.
Exactly. And I can be talking, or you can also minimize my face if you don't want to see my face. So that's up to you and on your computer. But I'm going to stop screen share here. Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah, hop on and we'll put your screen share up and make sure it's.
Okay, we might as well just do it. Let's see if I'll have to. Let me.
So log out of this. You'll need to use the other link to get into class.
Oh, okay.
To get into your class.
Shall do. Okay, let me leave the meeting.
Okay, bye-bye.
I got to get back up there again.